Welcome. I'm Gary Goldman from MAST, Massachusetts Antisemitism Synagogue Task Force. I serve on the executive board with Alice Bressman and Sherry Bollicker. In honor of End Jew Hatred Day, MAST presents Nachum Kaplan. Nachum Kaplan is a journalist, commentator, and media strategist who has 30 years international media experience and held senior international roles at Reuters and IFR. He writes the Moral Clarity Substack on Israel and Jewish matters, which is read by 100,000 readers a month in 88 countries. He is also a licensed and practicing psychotherapist. Now, without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce Nachum Kaplan. Nachum?
Thank you very much for the kind and welcome introduction. My name is Nachum Kaplan, and as you can no doubt hear from my accent, I am an Australian, although more than half of my readers are in the United States, so I'm very much writing for an American audience. Just a little bit about myself, because my personal story connects to what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to talk about two things today. I'm going to talk about Asia in particular, so try and offer a perspective that you might not hear very often. I actually live in Singapore, so I'm in the heart of Asia. The biggest difference between Asia and other parts of the world is the way that Israel is reported. Israel and Jewish matters are very central stories in the United States, in North America, in Europe, in most of the West. But in Asia, where most people are not even of a monotheistic faith, with a few exceptions, Israel does not feature anywhere near so largely. So they have a very different view on it. I'd like to talk today about my time living in Indonesia, which is the world's largest Muslim country, which may come as a surprise to some people. Indonesia has got about just under 300 million people, of which 90% are Muslim, and they are famously moderate Muslims, although as we shall see, it's a little bit more complicated than that. And then for the second part, I'd like to talk about China, and particularly how we are now in a world where China is a superpower, and what does that mean for Israel? So let me move on to my story. Growing up in Australia, it was very British when I was a child. It was already multicultural, but when I went to school, I had a choice of learning either French or German. And I can remember looking at a map thinking, why am I learning French or German when I could be learning Chinese or Japanese or Indonesian? And it just made no sense to me whatsoever. So as soon as I got to university, I enrolled in Indonesian and I became a language student. And I spent some time at a university in Indonesia. And there I had some interesting encounters with Muslims and anti-Semites of all persuasions. I lived in a town where I was studying called Yogyakarta, which is right in the middle of central Java. And it's a really relaxed town. It's a university town. It's a big tourist town. It's just a chilled, relaxed place. And although most people there are Muslim, there's a large Catholic community, and even the Muslims there are syncretic Muslims. So although they follow Islam, half of them kind of believe that there's a God in the mountain and a God in the river as well. And that was kind of my experience, or my first experience of Islam in Indonesia. And it was all pretty cool and pretty fun, but sometimes I would get bored because it's just a small town. So what I would do is get on my motorcycle and I would ride to the next city over. And the next city over is called Solo. That's not the right slide, is it, Chris? Ah, yeah.
Nachum, Nachum, we had a request if there's somehow to make it full screen.
Oh, sorry. My bad. My very bad. Of course, I can make it full screen.
Okay, thank
Uh,
you.
how's that?
Yeah, that's better. Beautiful.
Ah, okay.
You know, the stuff on
Very.
the side. Beautiful.
So when bored, I'd get on my motorcycle and ride down to Solo. It's about an hour drive through lovely bright terraced rice fields. But Solo is a very different city. It's a hardcore Muslim city. And I mean both conservative and extreme. You feel it the moment you arrive. There is much, much less alcohol available. There is no nightlife to speak of. And it is so strange that when men and women look at each other there or talk to each other, they will not even look at each other in the eye. They will literally sit there and look past each other so that they're not making eye contact with a member of the other sex, um, which is a pretty strange sight to see, and it must make for one very, very difficult dating scene. Uh, it's also a magnet for students of Islam or students of fairly conservative Islam. So they have these things called pesantren, which basically means an Islamic boarding school. So people go and they either study the Quran very deeply, or there's often the case they get radicalized. And when we talk about radicalized, I mean violent radicalization. This small town is what produced many of the biggest terror attacks or anti Western terror attacks in Southeast Asia. They blew up the Marriott Hotel in the capital city, Jakarta, killing 12 people and injuring 150 solely because it was an American hotel. If you I've spent quite a bit of time at Marriott hotels around the world, and they've always got sort of tightened security because it's emblematic of the United States. People from this town were also behind the bombings in Bali in 2002, where they blew up a nightclub, killing more than 200 people and another 200. So we're talking a pretty big uh, terror attack there. They blew up or tried to blow up the Australian embassy in the capital, Jakarta, and killing 12 people. That bomb only managed to go off outside of the embassy because the embassy is actually a fortress. And they even tried to blow up the Jakarta Stock Exchange while I was on the 14th floor of it. Very luckily, that bomb never went beyond the car park, or I wouldn't be here talking to you today. Uh, so this so-called moderate country, which practices moderate Islam, has produced plenty of violent jihadists who do not like Jews, even though there are no Jews in Indonesia, or virtually no Jews, and they do not like Americans, and they do not like the West. And for the longest time, I had this disconnect. I couldn't quite understand how this famously moderate country was producing these crazy people. It just didn't make any sense to me. And it didn't make any sense how the city I was living in was so relaxed and so tolerant, while the city just an hour drive down the road was producing lunatics. What it turns out is really to do with questions of identity. So there are actually two kinds, well, to keep it simple, two kinds of Muslim in Indonesia. There's those that are who consider themselves Indonesians first and Muslims second, and there are those who consider themselves Muslims first and Indonesians second. Now, this audience might understand this. I think every Jew in the diaspora has sort of asked the question, am I an American Jew or a Jewish American? Am I an Australian Jew or a Jewish Australian? So these questions of identity play out in the Muslim world as well. So when we're talking about moderate Islam in Indonesia, what we're really talking about people for whom religion sits within their wider national identity. So their public life is plural and civic and pretty moderate, and Islam is just a private faith for these people. But then there is the other group who are Muslims first and Indonesians second. In other words, they would be more than happy to replace the modern nation state of Indonesia with a caliphate. So these people's politics are absolutist, and they are complete radicals. So every time I hear about Indonesia being one of the most moderate Muslim countries in the world, I always kind of shake my head. It's become like a propaganda point for Indonesia, as if they pretend it's a reasonable place when the truth is more complex. Some of them are reasonable, some of them are not. Now, when all this violence happened, all these bombings that I was talking about, the Indonesian government cracked down hard, really hard. And Indonesia was just coming out of being a dictatorship to a democracy. So it still had a lot of the tools of a dictatorship. So it could crack down on Muslim extremists, with the kind of vigor that Western countries cannot do. So they cracked down on it. And for a short while, it looked like they had it under control. It turns out they were pretty good at cracking these extremist networks. And it turns out that Indonesia is very, very good at de-radicalizing people. They have one of the world's best de-radicalization programs. So when we look at somewhere like how to de-radicalize Gaza or how to de-radicalize Judea and Samaria, it is countries like Indonesia who've got a long record of doing this successfully that the world ought to be looking to. But they're nothing if not resourceful, Islamists. When they were cracked down and they couldn't blow things up anymore, they changed strategy. They turned themselves less from terror groups and into political parties, and they started contesting municipal elections. So they'd get hold of local councils, and then they would pass Islamic bylaws. So, you have to wear a hijab if you are in this municipality. You can't have sex outside marriage if you are in this municipality. There are effective blasphemy laws if you live in this municipality. There is no alcohol at all. It's effectively dry in this municipality. So you end up with all these municipalities, which are essentially, they don't have full Sharia law, but they have Sharia light. It's all in intents and purposes. So they didn't succeed in building a caliphate by blowing things up, but they are succeeding in building a much more intolerant Islamic society by getting control of local government. Now, what's interesting about this is exactly what Muslim groups have done in Europe as well. So there's been large numbers of sort of Muslim immigration to Europe, and what they've done there is exactly the same thing. If you go to Germany or Holland or parts of Spain or Portugal, there are entire municipalities, sometimes even suburbs of the capital cities like Amsterdam, where basically you're under Sharia light law. If you're a woman and you walk in there without a hijab, you are going to feel and made to feel extremely uncomfortable indeed. So what we now have is, we've got in Muslim countries like Indonesia, they are getting control of local government, and in European countries like Germany and Holland and increasingly the UK, they are getting control of Western countries by getting control of municipal governments, which of course brings us to New York City and Mandami. So he is following the precise model that Islamic groups have followed in Asia and followed in Europe, which is to present yourself as moderate, get control of local government, and then start slowly over time changing ordinances until over time the city becomes unrecognizable. New York is the test case for this, because if it's worked everywhere in the world, there's no reason this approach can't work in America. And if it can work in New York City, it can work anywhere. So just want to put into your mind that when you think about Mandami, he's not some unique American phenomena. He is following a well-established playbook that has been extremely successful in other parts of the world. So I don't know. I know this is a Massachusetts gathering, or if anyone is joining from New York, I know I have a large number of readers there, and this is the message that I always try to get through to them with varying degrees of success. So this next slide that I've got up is just kind of the method that they use. And this first one is one I'd like to talk to you about. Belief, it's got belief in inevitability, strategic patience, coercion at key moments, and calls for strength and not accommodation. Now, belief in inevitability is a key part of anti-Semitism in its Islamic form. We all know that anti-Semitism takes many forms, but a big one at the moment is in its Islamic form. So when I was in this town solo where all the extreme nutters are, I was walking past the mosque one day, and it was a Friday afternoon, and people were just coming out of their Friday prayers, and I could see two men walking towards me. Now, Indonesians are friendly and chatty people, and foreigners are rare in these parts, so I thought they were coming over for a friendly chat. But then, as soon as they came over, the first thing they said to me is, "Are you Muslim?" I said, "No, I'm not." I didn't give any more information than that. And one of them said, "You will be." And I asked, why is that? And then he told me about the impending holy war, the impending caliphate that they're going to build, which for him was an inevitability. They don't have the view that we want to achieve this goal and we're just going to work for it. And hopefully, if we play our cards right, it's going to be a success. They believe it's an inevitability. And this gives them enormous strategic patience. It doesn't matter to them if it works in a month, works in a year, or you're like the Muslim Brotherhood the banned Muslim Brotherhood out of Egypt, which has a 100-year plan to bring down the West. It's very hard to defeat someone who believes their victory is not only religiously inspired, but an inevitability. So it doesn't matter how well they fight this fight, they believe they're going to win it. It's very hard to reason with such people, if not impossible. So they have this enormous strategic patience. By contrast, in the West, we think in 3 or 4 year election cycles. And that makes it very, very difficult to combat long-term strategies. So they think it's inevitable. They're very patient about it. And in key moments, they will turn to violence or turn to politics to press their cause. So while they'll be very patient, pretending they're nice people, once they see their opportunity, they will start setting off the bombs or start getting control of the legislatures. And once they do so, what they do is they do not accommodate anyone else. They really demand, as this person said to me, "You will be." So the expectation is they're going to convert us all to Islam. Now, I only spoke to these people for about 2 minutes because I realized immediately that I was talking to complete lunatics and wanted to get myself out of there. But as I was going away, he yelled, "Death to Israel, death to America, Allahu Akbar." So death to Israel. Well, he didn't know that I was Jewish. We hadn't talked about Israel at all. That was just part of his mantra. I don't think he knew that I'm not an American, but he yelled that out anyway. So this is a man, he's got nothing to do with Israel. He's got nothing to do with the United States. He's got nothing to do with Jews, but he's sitting there in a country with no Jews, plotting ways to harm us. So there just isn't any way that you can look at that scenario and say, oh, they're like this because of Western imperialism or because of interventionist policy. They are like this because they are crazed zealots, evil crazed zealots. And it is as simple as that. And if you are a decent person and a fair and decent minded person, it's incredibly difficult to get your head around the fact that not everybody is like you. And there are actual complete lunatics in the world. So this was kind of my background exposure to Islam and to fanatical Islam. And then I didn't think about it too much. I just kind of got on with my life. And that was until October the 7th happened. When October the 7th happened, I was incandescent, shall we say. And I wasn't just incandescent at the event itself, um, although it was hideous and shocking. I was, in fact, aware that human beings do really terrible things to each other. But what shocked me more was the response to it in two ways. One way was just how much support Hamas had and the Palestinian side had when they had just conducted a pogrom. They were suddenly the good guys. And that was when I really started to see right across the Western world that anti Semitism was back, anti Semitism was acceptable again, um, and widespread. Uh, Being a kind of punchy person by nature, I thought I'm not going to tolerate this. So that was when I actually started writing my newsletter, Moral Clarity, which I'll link to later. And then, much to my surprise, it took off really quickly. And one of the main things it did was talk about how the media distorts everything. And I was able to offer a very good view on that because I'm a career journalist for many decades. I've also worked as a media strategist. So I've kind of worked on the dark side as well as the light side. And these days, I also practice as a psychotherapist. So I bring quite a lot of psychology into my analysis of what motivates these people. So that's a kind of interesting mix. And I was unhappy with the response. And I also felt that the response from the Jewish community, particularly in the diaspora, was inadequate. It seemed to me to be out of another era. It seemed that they would they were murdering us, and we were basically saying anti-Semitism, anti-Semitism, stop the anti-Semitism, we can't have that, and we were going running to the headmaster or the school principal. It really was a case that they were having a street fight, and Jews were playing by Bloomsbury rules. Um, and this just annoyed the hell out of me because I think we need to take the fight to these people. Um, and I feel that very strongly. And that was the genesis of why I started writing Moral Clarity, which has now gets about 100,000 unique readers a month in 88 countries. So the message seems to have resonated with lots and lots of people. So that's kind of the first half of my presentation. Now, the second half I'd like to talk about is, oh, I'm sorry, there's one last point that I missed. Moderate Muslims become unmoderate when the issue of Israel comes up. So shortly after my time studying in Java, I moved to a newspaper in Jakarta, the capital. If you're wondering, Jakarta is an enormous city of about 25 million people. I think it's officially the biggest city in the world now. And it has a strange claim to fame of having more shopping centers or more malls than any other city in the world. So that's a reason not to go there, if you ask me. So I was working for a newspaper there, and this was a pretty moderate, progressive, liberal newspaper by Indonesian standards. Its staff were probably 80% Muslim, but there was a significant you know, Christian population among the staff and quite a few foreigners as well. Now, with my name, and when you have a name like mine, you can't hide your background. I was immediately targeted for conversations on the Middle East. Wasn't insulted or anything like that. Just he's the man to have conversations with. Now, this newspaper had a pro-Palestinian editorial policy, as do all newspapers in Indonesia, and that was fine. I'm familiar with that, and I didn't feel too bad about it because a guy's got to earn a living, right? So I would talk to these people, and none of these people were extremists. None of them wanted a caliphate. None of them wanted Sharia law. All of them were educated, except they became lunatics when you started talking about Israel. So when I would constantly ask them, why do you care so much about this conflict? The first response they'd always give was Muslim solidarity. Then that obviously doesn't make any sense. There's lots of conflicts involving Muslims around the world, and there are lots of conflicts where Muslims are on both sides of them around the world, and where much more Muslims are killed or injured or displaced in those conflicts. So that's actually not it. And then after a while, they kind of go quiet because they know they can't answer that question. And then the truth starts to come out. It's what sits at the heart of their argument is not Jews themselves, but that Jews have sovereignty in a land that they consider to be Muslim land. So they have this idea that once a land has been under Islamic rule, it must forever be under Islamic rule, which is why if you look at groups like Hamas and read their charters, after they've destroyed Israel, the next thing they want to do is retake Andalusia in Spain and Portugal and regain those parts of the old Ottoman Caliphate. So at the core of their dislike of Jews and dislike of Israel, and they've never met any Israelis, and before me, probably not many Jews, they already don't like us because we have a sovereign state in what they see as Muslim territory. And this really brought home to me the extent to which this is not a territorial dispute. This is not a dispute about two people fighting over the same land. That's just a shallow overlay. The real objection is Jewish self-determination and Jewish sovereignty. Now, none of these people were extremists, but once they start talking like this, they did not sound any different at all to the extremists that I'd met outside the mosque a couple of years earlier. This really brought home that the difference between the moderate Muslims and fanatical Muslims, there's a big, big difference between them. But when it comes to the issue of Israel, they sound identical to each other. They just merge. Okay, so that's the first part of my presentation. Thank you for bearing with me. Now, the second part, what I want to talk about is I spoke about being a young boy in Australia and wanting to go to Asia because Asia was next door to my country and I shouldn't be learning French or German. The other reason that I went there, because it was clear then that what has happened in Asia since was going to happen. The boom that has happened in Asia has been astronomical over that time. If you were to fly from, which I've done many times, if you fly from Newark to the airport in Singapore, it is like traveling 40 years in time. The infrastructure here is so much more advanced, more developed. If you have a picture in your head of what Asia looks like, I guarantee you have a picture in your head of what it looks like 20 years ago, and the whole region is 5, 6, 7 times richer now than it was then. So Asia now is the political, geographic, and economic center of the world. And we could see that in defense spending outside of the US. We can see it in financial flows. We can see it in percentage of GDP. We can see it in the percentage of the population that lives in Asia. Yet, when we read about the world in the Western press, you don't get that sense at all. You just get the sense that there's big, nasty China there who scares everyone and we have to worry about. And that's kind of it. So the whole center of power has shifted, and the Western media is just not reporting this at all. And this has implications for Israel. What it means for Israel is, what does it mean to be a small Jewish state in an Asian-centered world when so far it's been a small Jewish state in a transatlantic world? And a lot of things are going to have to change for Israel and its foreign policy. Some of this has started to happen, some of it is not, or not yet. But this is what I feel needs to happen. Now, this is particularly pertinent at a time where Israeli relations with Europe are pretty strained. You can't pick up the newspaper without some gormless European leader condemning Israel. We see the anti-Israel sentiment growing in the United States, particularly in the Democratic Party. But there's also anti-Semitic lunatics and isolationists on the right as well. So we're seeing Israel's traditional allies either become less important in the case of Europe, or want to become less engaged in the case of the United States, while at the same time, this giant place called Asia is becoming the center of the world. So Israel needs to develop a foreign policy that reflects that split. Yeah. So as I mentioned earlier, in the global center is somewhere between Shanghai, Mumbai, and Singapore, wherever that would be in Asia. That's where the world's biggest shipping routes are. So that's where the goods are all flowing. When we talk about Iran closing the Straits of Hormuz, what we are talking about is them shutting the straits to Asia. These are the waters through which one ships to India and ships to China and ships to Japan. Not just oil, but also commodities and supply goods. So what is Israel to do about this? That's kind of the key question. Now, we've already had the issue of what is Israel to do about its relationship with the United States. Netanyahu has already said that he would like to be less dependent or not dependent on US defense equipment within 10 years. A large chunk of that Israel can no doubt do, but for projects like giant submarines and F-35 fighter jets and things, Israel will never be able to produce them on its own. So it will always have to have a relationship with larger countries, including the United States. So even if that relationship is downgraded somewhat, it's still going to remain an important partner for Israel. For Europe, I consider Europe to be completely, utterly, and totally insignificant, and I don't know why anybody writes about it anymore. It counts for about 10 or 12% of GDP. It's allowing itself to be taken over by Muslim immigrants. It is run by quasi-socialist lunatics who are unaware of what's happening, and it's just not worth talking about. They don't matter anymore. And with a couple of exceptions for Israel, particularly Germany and Italy, which are the two European countries from which Israel buys its most arms in Europe, the rest of Europe doesn't matter. And whenever I read about the UK or France condemning Israel, I just make myself a cup of tea, because I don't really care, because it doesn't matter at all. What does matter is Asia. Okay. Now, when we talk Asia, we've got two really big countries. We've got China and we've got India. India recently surpassed China as the world's most populous country. So India's got about 1.2 billion people now. China's got about a billion people now. So let's talk about China first, because China is more advanced and more powerful than India at this point, and China is the first near peer power that the United States has faced since the fall of the Soviet Union. So there's a proper superpower rivalry going on between the US and China. So it's unimaginable that Israel cannot have a relationship with China, given its importance. And in many ways, economically speaking, they're pretty well matched for each other. Um, Israel is the startup nation. Its innovation and technology, its ability to raise capital is second to none. It's got outsized success and innovation in artificial intelligence, machine learning, cybersecurity. It's a world leader in medical tech and agricultural tech. Its universities are world class, and they partner with universities all over the world, including universities with China. So all that is very attractive to China because China is a big lumbering communist state. And that enables it to do really big projects well, but it makes it slow, it makes it less nimble, and it makes it less innovative. But in theory, they have enormous manufacturing scale and infrastructure development. They have a huge domestic market of a billion people, and they have shown that they can build infrastructure and energy projects at incredible pace. So, the idea of Israeli tech playing a role at scale in China ought to be a pretty compelling story for Israel. And it is economically. However, it's more complicated because China is not all that friendly towards Israel. Now, China is not anti-Israel per se. China considers the Chinese are essentially cultural superiorists. They have long considered Westerners to be barbarians. They are officially an atheist country because they are communist, but underlying that is still kind of traditional Chinese polytheism. So these people just do not give a rat's ass about the Palestinian question. They do not care at all whether Judea and Samaria belongs to Israel or the Palestinians. And they see absolutely nothing sacred about the first temple, the second temple, or the Dome of the Rock. They just don't know why these strange barbarians are fighting over things in the desert. That's literally how they view it. But they also understand that it's a very strong American ally and it's a point of American influence in the region. What the Chinese want to do is keep the Americans as much as possible occupied and bogged down in the Middle East. The Americans have been saying under both parties actually that they want to pivot to Asia. They want to pivot to Asia to deal with the China problem because Europe doesn't matter anymore. The Chinese don't want them pivoting there. They don't want the Americans on their backyard any more than they are. So they like to meddle in the Middle East and create problems. So America is there saying, we want to pivot to Asia. And meanwhile, they've got 3 aircraft carriers right off Iran right now, which is the precise opposite of a pivot to Asia and a pivot to China. So, strategically, China has an interest in keeping the region, or Israel particularly, somewhat unstable. The Chinese always play a multi-layered game. They play 4-dimensional chess. So while they want it to be unstable and cause problems for the Americans, they also recognize that Israel is a gateway state between East and West, and there are opportunities that they can invest in there as well. The most controversial example has been a Chinese company that manages the main port in Haifa. Right now, the main port in Haifa is full of American warships. So we have a situation of half a dozen American warships docked in an Israeli port that are managed by the Chinese. So you can see that the security risk there is pretty high, and the Americans have waved their flag pretty aggressively towards the Israelis to be much more stringent about taking investment from China or taking investment from hostile countries. And China is right now trying to use its black market fleet to buy Iranian oil and to rearm Iran. So it's a complicated relationship. One thing is clear, although it may be the next superpower or the second superpower, there is just no conceivable universe in which China will be a great ally of Israel that Israel could depend on if relations with the US weaken or do not become as dependable. There's also another problem for Israel, which is the imbalance in that relationship. So Israel really needs China. It needs access to those markets. Everyone in the world needs to have economic exposure to this giant economy, but China does not need Israel. China likes to have access to Israel so it can meddle in the Middle East and meddle with American policy, but it really wouldn't make any difference at all if they didn't have relationships with Israel. So it's a very asymmetrical relationship. So that means that Israel will never really be able to depend on China, even if it has to have relationships with it, both economic and political. So what Israel needs to do, to my mind, it needs to have a diversification strategy. What it needs to do, instead of having one giant partner like the United States upon which it's overly dependent, what it needs to do is still have a solid relationship with the United States, but actually have a portfolio of allies, none of which it is overly dependent on, but each which provides a degree of redundancy for the others. So there are actually many ways for a country to be secure. Having a big brother is one of them, but having a large family of little brothers is pretty useful too. And I think that's the model that Israel needs to move to. The good news is they've actually started doing this. Whatever you think about the Israeli government, and this hasn't got much news coverage, they've done pretty well on this front. India is not as developed as China, but it's only 10 years behind. It is another coming superpower in its own right. And India and Israel have developed incredibly close relations in recent years. They never used to have close relations because India was very much tied up in socialist ideology and non-aligned politics and things like that. But in recent years, as it's liberalized its economy, it's trying to build its tech sector, which Israel can help it greatly with. It has enormous problems with Islamic terrorism to its north, both in Kashmir and in Pakistan. So it understands what it's like to have Muslim extremists blow things up. So it has that same natural suspicion. It also doesn't care about monotheistic religion at all, which means it boasts very proudly that India has no history of anti-Semitism at all. And that's largely true, but that's not because they're wonderful people. It's because they just think that that whole part of the world is religiously misguided. So it's literally what they think. So that relationship is deepening. That's not just the case of India buying technology from Israel. There are missiles being jointly developed. There are satellites being jointly developed. There's a proper strategic integrated partnership forming between those two countries. And that is just going to grow and grow and grow. And India is not very prone to foreign politics and foreign influence. So it runs an extremely pragmatic foreign policy. Let's put it that way. I'm just mindful of the time because I've gone on and on and on and on and on. So what we've moved to here is what Israel needs to do in the post-Europe century. So the first thing it needs to do is widen its network of allies. The benefit it will get from this is that it will have more allies and be less dependent, and it will also have to put up with less sanctimonious moralizing, which Israel has to put up from Europe at the moment. For Israel, there's going to be a trade-off in this. So the relationships may be politically easier, but they're going to be strategically less predictable because Asian countries tend to be more self-interested in their politics. They take a realist approach rather than a normative approach. And finally, Israel is going to have to earn the trust and understand the cultures of these countries. Israel is one of the homes of Western culture. If you think of Western culture kind of runs through Jerusalem, it runs through Athens, it runs through the Enlightenment. They're, to my mind, at least the three pillars of it. That's got nothing to do with Asia. So Israel is going to have to learn precisely how to navigate those cultures with which it is less familiar. And I'm just going to jump to my last slide here and give myself a plug. Moral clarity is a way that you can help fight anti-Semitism and support Israel in a way that's a little bit less conventional. So it's very, very opinionated. It's probably in the current politics leans a little bit right wing, but it takes hard punches at the right as well as the left. Make no mistake. You can join it for free, and if you do that, you'll get 3 sort of 1,500-word essays a week, and they are professionally written essays because that's what I do. But if you do the paid membership, you get basically like a 1,500-word essay a day, so 5 to 7 a week, as well as Q&As, podcasts, and events like this for $45 a year. And that's incredibly cheap compared to most Substacks. And what I always try to encourage people to say is it takes a lot of time to write this. I have a job as well, and I have to earn a living. And the more people support this newsletter, the more I am able to write this stuff and produce the kind of commentary on Israel that you don't get in any other places. I have talked enough, so let me hand back to Gary.
Thank you so much, Nachum. Wow, that was incredible. I learned so much, and as I'm sure our audience did. We have a number of questions that have been pouring in. First, I wanted to get to a few of the ones that were submitted by the people that originally signed up, and after that, there's people that have been that have some questions that they're putting them in the chat. So I think a good starting point would be, can you define anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, and why is there so much Jew hatred in the world today?
Wow, there's a thesis question that needs a doctorate to answer it. I mean, anti-Semitism, I just consider to be Jew hatred. I think it's as simple as that. I know there are various different definitions of it, but I just consider it that. So if you hate Jews, you're an anti-Semite, no matter why you hate Jews. It can come from the Christian world, and it can come from the Muslim world. It can come from the right. It can come from the left. It can come from the sort of atheist, communist, totalitarian world. Even though they may have slightly different drivers behind them, I consider all that just to be straight anti-Semitism because it's Jew hatred. And I think we make it too complicated when we try and come up with sophisticated definitions. If you are debating the meaning of what you're talking about, you're definitely not winning the PR campaign. Explaining is losing when it comes to PR. The second part of the question was what? I'm sorry, Gary. Was why? Was that the?
Anti-Zionism, and why is it increasing today?
Yeah, so anti-Zionism is unquestionably just anti-Semitism. I don't accept any other explanation. I am, of course, familiar with the argument that one could theoretically be okay with Jewish people, but not like the Jewish state. But I think that misunderstands Judaism. If one thinks of what Judaism is, it's not exactly like other religions. It consists of the word, it consists of the people, and it consists of the land. Now, if you take the land out of that, if those three things are necessary for Jews to live as Jews, and you take one of those three legs out of it, Jews can no longer live as Jews. So that's why I see anti-Zionism as straight out anti-Semitism, and I think it's been a very, very successful tactic that instead of us just saying, no, you're an anti-Semite, go away, we've got ourselves bogged down in definitions of anti-Semitism, definitions of anti-Zionism, and all these kinds of things. Once again, in public relations, if you're explaining, you're losing.
So we shouldn't be we shouldn't be concerned about the fact that after the October 7th attack, the anti-Semitic attacks everywhere in the world went up over 300%. We shouldn't be concerned about that.
We should be extremely concerned about that, but we shouldn't. We should respond directly, forcefully, and by calling a spade a spade. It's not like, oh, he's not an anti-Semite, he's just an anti-Zionist. No, he hates Jews and he's a nasty piece of work. That's how to talk about these people. They hold views that are insane. People who are insane or hold insane views should be held up to ridicule. We need to stop engaging in serious debate with people who are unhinged and deeply unserious. As to why it's become acceptable again, I mean, that's a really big question. One is I think it never really went away. I think we just saw the extent to which it was culturally suppressed for long enough, and then it was kind of the lid was lifted off it and it was already there. But the other reason is the likes of Iran and the likes of Qatar have actually seeded our societies and our institutions with anti-Israel, anti-imperialist rhetoric. They have control of the universities. They have control of think tanks. They're playing this very, very long game where they've been laying the intellectual foundation for this for a long time. So it looked to us with our 3 or 4 year election cycles that, oh, it just came out of nowhere, and that they've been working on this project for 40 years.
Okay, we have a lot of other questions, so thank you so much for your expert opinion. How can anyone anywhere believe there are moderate Muslims, those who don't hate and aren't inclined to kill and take over the world, when the Quran tells them to lie, enslave, murder anyone who does not convert? To me, that means they can tell you they aren't the hardcore bad guys, when in reality they may well be, because their book dictates those behaviors. How do you respond to that?
No, I think that's largely true. The book does say that, and a natural reading of the Quran. I don't know how many of you have read it. It's worth reading just to know what they say. It's not worth reading in that it's deeply boring and repetitive and devoid of any literary merit whatsoever. The King James Bible, it is not. It does say that, but there is in fact such a thing as Muslim moderate. So while there are definitely passages in the Quran that are deeply there have been times in history where those passages of the Quran have basically been pushed back into the background and not given any prominence, in the same way that we don't give prominence to many of the horrific injunctions that are in Book of Leviticus, for example. And then there are other times, like now, where those parts of the Quran are made much more prominent, and it's made a more central thesis. So there are certainly times and people who are moderate Muslims, but in terms of the overall message of the religion, I'm not sure who asked the question, but yeah, I think it's a very, very good point to make. Um, it is a religion on how to take over the world if you wish to take it at face value. And the only way you can get away from that is by engaging in sort of mental gymnastics to pretend that it means something else. So I'm not very flexible, unfortunately. So gymnastics are not my thing.
Okay, we've got some great questions rolling in, and thank you for your expertise. Do you feel the recent cooperation of Israel and UAE with Iron Dome equipment is the start of a long-term relationship and an inspiration for more Gulf states, or only as long as Iran can pull any triggers? Will there be more Gulf state allies, or only some normalization?
Yeah, fascinating question indeed. I think it is the beginning of greater cooperation, because even though Israel only has formal relations with four or six, we've got the Abraham Accords plus Egypt and Jordan, I guess. It already has pretty close ties with Saudi Arabia. You could fly on an LL flight over Saudi Arabia these days. Intelligence cooperation between Israel and Saudi Arabia is enormous, and where Saudi Arabia goes, the rest of the Arab world will follow. It's fairly clear to everyone now that the main destabilizing force in the Middle East is Iran, and we've seen that not just we've seen it in this recent war where America and Israel attack Iran, and Iran turns around and starts attacking all these Arab states. So you now have Israeli and American military assets defending Gulf states. So their security interests have never ever been clearer. We also see that the Gulf states and Israel are allied with the West, whereas Iran is more allied with China and Russia in kind of a Netflix version of the Cold War, shall we say, a watered down version of the Cold War. Now, if what would happen if the Iranian regime fell and a normal regime came to power? Would that be peace in the Middle East? I don't think so. I think what will happen is the region will go back to its favorite conflict, which is the Sunni Shia conflict within Islam, and they will just continue that fight, and Israel will have a less central role in it.
Very good. Thank you. What will U.S.-Israel relations be in the future? I know Israel wants to be less dependent on the United States, but what is your vision in 5 years and 10 years down the road?
But that is the $100 billion question, isn't it? More than 100 billion. I don't know how much the military aid adds up to. It's on what's difficult about it is the way support for Israel has become a partisan issue in American politics. There used to be bipartisan support for Israel. Now that seems to be breaking down, with the Democrats being less supportive of Israel and the Republicans being more supportive of Israel. Although, having said that, within the Republican Party, there are also its lunatic fringe and its isolationist fringe who just don't want to be involved in foreign wars, period. So there are lots of forces saying we shouldn't really be involved in the Middle East so much. And one way to do that is to have fewer ties with Israel. From Israel's point of view, um, they will no doubt have trouble replacing what America provides them with. They certainly have the capacity to produce much of their weaponry by themselves. But as I mentioned earlier, the really big ticket items like submarines and fighter aircraft and things, they're always going to have to build those things as part of a consortium. The challenge is going to be how to keep America involved in the region when parts of it want to withdraw, parts of it want to stay away from Israel, and parts of it want to repivot to Asia. So how does it look in 10 years? Your guess is as good as mine, I'm afraid. I'm happy to have opinions, but I'm not that good a soothsayer, I'm afraid.
Okay, very good. So one person wants to know, what do you suggest that Jews on this broadcast can do to combat anti-Semitism?
It depends on what form the anti-Semitism takes. Um, the one thing that we need to do is present ourselves as strong. Um, you know, bullies target weak people. Bullies have a skill in which they pick their targets. And if you are the kind of person who, when you're insulted, bursts into tears and goes running into the other room, you're not very equipped to deal with the enemy that we are facing right now. We need to basically stand in front of them and say, you people are genocidal lunatics. Look at you, and treat them with absolute contempt and call them out and speak of them. We don't need to. What we need to do is show the world how crazy these people are. We need to let them damn themselves rather than just continuing with talking points. We also have to stop thinking that education is the answer to fighting anti-Semitism. It's not. Most of Israel's enemies are entirely aware of the Holocaust. Many of them want another Holocaust. They march outside of Auschwitz. Um, they know perfectly well education of what happened in Europe has offered no protection whatsoever. So knowing about the Holocaust is absolutely essential in terms of educating people, but as a tool to fight anti-Semitism, it's achieved actually nothing. We've had 80 years of such education now, and anti-Semitism is at its worst at any time since then. If that's not a failed strategy, I don't know what is. We really need to ridicule these people. We need to call them insane, call them names, talk about how crazy they are, and stop trying to make rational arguments when we are not in a rational fight. We are responding with, long, sophisticated academic arguments, and they're fighting with memes. We are in a time warp.
Thank you so much. Some really great questions coming in. Many people still trust the news media, which I now see as priming anti-Israel propaganda. What can we do about it? And this seems to be in contradistinction to the fact that Jews supposedly control the media, among other things. Doesn't make sense.
Dead right, dead right. Absolutely spot on from the questioner there. Um, the idea that Jews control the media, well, we must be really, really bad at controlling things given how we get slaughtered in the media day in, day out. It makes no sense. The questioner is also absolutely correct that there is a strong anti-Israel bias in most of the Western media. No question whatsoever. How many people still trust the media? To be honest with you, I'm not sure. I think it's less than we think. I think if we look at the last US presidential election and we look at US media coverage of Trump in particular, forget whether you like Trump or not, they just completely missed the fact that large numbers of Americans were going to vote for Trump. And people could see very clearly that the media was entirely out of sync with what the American people were doing. And then we saw the exact same thing play out in the Gaza war, where what was actually happening on the ground in Gaza was entirely different to the narrative. We had Israel fighting a war with the lowest civilian to casualty ratio in civilian to combatant ratio in the history of urban warfare. And in the Western media, this was genocide somehow. These two things are just completely poles apart. And we're seeing it again in coverage of the Iran war, where America and Israel have managed to destroy the entire Iranian military, and this is somehow being portrayed as a strategic victory for Iran. I mean, the last time I looked, when you blow up all the enemy's equipment, you've won the war. That's certainly how it's been, like up until 10 minutes ago. So I think people trust the media less and less. And I think people are reading things like my newsletter, are reading more and more alternative media. Um, and it's very hard to get visibility on alternative media because you might subscribe to something, but you've got no idea what the guy next to you is subscribing to. So for every pro-Israel piece I write, there's someone out there writing a pro-Palestinian piece, and we don't have a lot of visibility on each other. So I think more and more of the debate is happening in that space now, and we can't really see it. But I don't think people do trust the media the way they did. And the ultimate sort of proof point of that is the media business is still in freefall. They blame it on technology change. They blame it on social media and all these kinds of things. But nowhere along the way have any of the leadership of these mastheads looked at themselves and said, you know, one of the reasons people aren't buying our product anymore is because our product is shit. And they're playing a role in it.
Okay, we have just a few last questions, and then we'll bring this to a close. Can you talk about what you envision the relationship with Israel and the Gazans, Judeans, and Palestinians, and over in Israel? What do you see as the future? Do you think are you in favor of a two-state solution, or what is your vision?
A two-state solution is a completely insane idea that will never work. One only needs to stand in the hills of Judea and Samaria, the West Bank. One only needs to stand on the hills where you can see the Mediterranean Sea, you can see Tel Aviv, you can see 80% of Israel, and you can see no country in its right mind is going to give up such a strategically important position. That is just not going to happen. Then there's the point that large numbers of Israelis and non-Israelis, people like myself, flat out think that Judea and Samaria is part of Israel, and the debate kind of ends there for me. Giving your land away is just a stupid thing to do. As for relations, I'm not very optimistic about them because it's not about a two-state solution or a one-state solution or any other constitutional arrangement. It's about the refusal of radicalized Palestinian population, their refusal to live with Jews. If they were willing to live peacefully with Jews, you could put any number of constitutional arrangements in there. You could put a confederation in there, one state, two states. You could be as creative. It could almost look like the Emirates. You know what I mean? There's any number of ways you could do it. No constitutional arrangement stops the problem, which is that the Palestinians do not want there to be a Jewish state in Israel. And until that is addressed, and I'm not sure how to address that, I'm pretty pessimistic about it.
Okay. Thank you so much. Fantastic presentation, and the Q&A was unbelievable. Thank you so much. I'd like to give you the opportunity now. Do you have a closing statement? And then I have a few things to say.
Oh, please subscribe to my newsletter. Please do. Please, please. You'd make me really, really happy.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Well, that was Nachum Kaplan. He told you about his moral clarity. He has over 100,000 subscribers, and perhaps you can become one of them. Anyways, this presentation was part of MAST, the Massachusetts Anti-Semitism Synagogue Task Force. Our next event is going to be on Wednesday, May 20th on Zoom at 8 o'clock in honor of Jewish American Heritage Month. MAST presents Joe Alterman discussing and playing Jewish contributions to American music. That's on Wednesday, May 20th. We hope all you can join us. And Nachum, thank you so much. Thanks to Sherry and Alice for helping me put this together as part of the executive board. And thanks to the audience. Loved all the questions, loved the participation. Just wonderful, wonderful. Thank you so much. Good night,
And
everybody.
thank you for the invitation, guys. I really do appreciate it.
Thank you.